Aaryaman, who can also take this opportunity to correct my awful pronunciation.
No, thank you, Robert. Thank you for that introduction. Aaryaman is fine. Most people call me AB. So if you're more comfortable in that, then go with that. And thank you for having me today. It's always a great privilege to be able to speak about the governance of English football, and particularly at such a critical moment with the white paper on the future of football being published just yesterday. And what I thought might be best to do is run through what I found in my publication for Civitas, which came out last week, which looked at the fan-led review on which the white paper has been commissioned, and explain some of my conclusions and compare them with what the government has now revealed. So I want to sort of go back to the start here and the commissioning of the fan-led review and its publication in 2021. This is almost an unprecedented level of investigation into men's football launched by the government. And it does sort of beg the question, what makes this necessary? How did English football get to the point where the government was forced to launch an independent review of governance across the sport? And the answer, as you've sort of alluded to, really is twofold. In brief, at the point of the fan-led review's publication, English football had become stretched to a point that was unsustainable. On the one hand, we had an epidemic of football clubs reaching the point of liquidation, administration, and technical insolvency. Familiar names, of course, would be Bury FC, Macclesfield Town, Rushden and Diamonds, Chester City, but of clubs that no longer exist or are no longer operational. But the problem in truth is much deeper than that, or does in fact risk becoming much deeper. In 2019, 2020, 37 of the 72 clubs within the Football League, the three divisions below the Premier League, were registered as technically insolvent. We've seen how close to the sun clubs like Derby County and Bolton Wanderers have come to going under, and this risks becoming a much more widespread problem. And then at the other end of the pyramid, what we've got, and again, you alluded to this, was the attempted formation of things such as the European Super League. Now, this risked creating the advent of closed-shop elitism, detracting from everything English football stands for. The idea that the beauty of English football is that any club from anywhere can reach the top of the profession with the right set of circumstances. And more than that, what this showed is the backlash against the competition caused by fans showed how isolated clubs have become from the ambitions of supporters and how isolated it's become from communities, which is what English football represents. English football is a hub for communities, and that's what football clubs are. And so came the fan-led review with 47 recommendations, and its breadth and range of issues which it covered were impressive. Everything from financial sustainability, which I'm sure Bob will know far more than I do, to player welfare, to supporter engagement and club heritage. As we know, out of this, chief amongst this, came the suggestion that an independent regulator should be introduced, a sort of footballing quango to ensure good governance in the sport. And this, as I've described in my piece for Conservative Home, has been for a long time the ugly duckling of solutions. Nobody wants more regulation. Nobody wants football being run from Westminster. Nobody, and Steve Parish, chairman of Crystal Palace, pointed this out yesterday, nobody wants to be the only major footballing nation where our competition is being run by the government. The costs, the threats, regulation, the very principle of it is almost obscene. But in this case, it may have just become the only option, at least in the short term. In fact, it's not the very idea of a regulator that should make us nervous, but the fact that the government's proposal is that such a regulator would be indefinite, that the future, no matter what, will see this form of regulation. Now, it's quite clear to most football fans that some form of change is needed. We're currently in a wild west of corporate governance. Firstly, we appear to be the only major footballing nation where the tail is able to effectively wag the dog. At the top of English football, we have and have had for a very, very long time an unsustainable competition for power between the traditional governing body of the sport, the FA, and the constituent leagues, the Premier League and the EFL. In 2009, a report by the All-Party Parliamentary Football Group on the governance of English football outlined the manner in which the Football Association, the Premier League and the EFL were continually competing for power and influence within the English footballing ecosystem. The report suggested that the FA should regain its role as the leading governing body, as the single voice and the overall regulator of the report. And whilst there should, in principle, be no issue with representation of various parties presenting individual ideas, the level of impasse between the FA, the EFL and the Premier League that has come into place since 1992 has been fairly catastrophic for men's football. And that is a point that needs to change. The Premier League and the formation of the Premier League has been described as something that has represented something the FA has always opposed. And this has led to several unsuccessful attempts from the FA over the past 30 years to reinstate power. In the 1990s, for example, there was a proposal to reduce the size of the league to 18 clubs. 2004, the Premier League fought back. They got 4 seats onto the FA board, giving them more influence to run English football. And so whilst in theory, since the publication of that report in 2009, the FA's authority has been restored, in theory, the Premier League's website itself says that the FA is the traditional governing body of the sport and regulates everything. It's clear that in practicality, the phenomenon of these competing voices to reach satisfactory resolutions on key issues in English football has persisted. And the result of this has been a continued struggle, Robert, for stability. In 2020, for example, I'm sure I won't need to explain again to football fans, the Premier League's biggest club spearheaded an attempt to reform English football through Project Big Picture. In 2021, the Big Six were reported to be fighting off an owner's charter put forward by the Premier League that would commit them to qualifying for the Champions League on sporting merit. These impasses go on, and the ramifications of this lack of unity goes further. We've seen in the news the impasse on financial redistribution between the Premier League and the EFL becoming increasingly problematic. The current system, whereby parachute payments, as they're called, are made across 3 years or 2 or 3 years by the Premier League to relegated clubs, has been accused of distorting the competitive balance of the leagues below, causing clubs in the Championship to spend excessively and beyond their means just to be able to compete. And it's been this that has been charged with causing the insolvency and liquidation of clubs across divisions, as owners gamble financially in order to attain on-field success with no plan B should that not be achieved. In the meantime, the chairman of the EFL, Rick Parry, has been calling for an increase in 25% in solidarity payments, the payments made to the EFL by the Premier League, which are split between the 72 clubs. The Premier League have remained sort of unmoved on that. And this has all become exacerbated by the current crop of owners present in English football. In terms of the financial sustainability, we've got a set of owners, in some cases, where the checks are not, they don't uphold enough, despite the fit and proper persons test, and we allow a culture of owner without that knowledge of the football industry. In 2004, the fit and proper persons test was first introduced for new football club owners, designed for the owners of any football club or whoever owns over 30% of the club. However, from the outset, the test design was fundamentally weak, and all it requires to pass the test is for a prospective owner or director to overcome a very reasonable set of conditions, the main point of which are conflicts of interest with other clubs, being in the process of filing for bankruptcy, or not having been director of a club, which have, of 2 separate clubs even, which have previously gone insolvent. Obviously, it's very, very easy to sort of pass. I could pass that test. And we've seen this most notably at clubs like Portsmouth, who between 2005 and 2013 had 5 different owners, including Eastern European conmen, businessmen with a penchant for stealing money from their wives, and property tycoons without any money at all. But Portsmouth were eventually sort of bailed out, and there are more tragic examples of this. Bury FC, for example, is the most notable, where Steve Dale was handed ownership of the club without the requisite money to be able to pay off wages or debt to HMRC. And what we see as well is it's not just the case of new owners. People who've been in charge of clubs for years and years, because there is no follow-up checks on these panel-led reviews, on these fit and proper persons tests, mean that if a person becomes unsuitable over time, as was the case of Mr. Al-Qadi at Macclesfield Town, who for 15 years provided solid investment and then effectively ran out of money to pay back debts, there is no check and balance to highlight a red flag that this person should no longer be in charge of this football club. And one of the byproducts of this inappropriate ownership structure has been a lack of supporter engagement, and supporters becoming increasingly isolated from the club that they love. And this was best seen, of course, through the attempted formation of the European Super League, but also on more sort of granular levels. During the 2020-2021 season, for example, Oldham Athletic experienced what was described as a complete breakdown in communications and relationships between supporters and ownership, when the club owner, the gentleman's name is Abdullah Lemsgazim, failed to deliver on several promises made to supporters and actually just banned 3 supporters from the stadium for promoting dislike of his regime. Birmingham City earlier this season as well became heavily criticised for a lack of transparency with local stakeholders over the club's most recent ownership crisis. That got into Westminster, that got into Parliament. These are 2 examples. I mean, the list is endless. I mean, I was listening to Action for Albion earlier. The West Bromwich Albion fan group are incredibly upset with their owner sucking money out of their football club. That's £9 million Mr. Guanchang now owes to West Brom. And these issues, whilst perhaps the most seminal, very much only scratch the surface. Football is sort of laden with a host of other problems, such as unregulated cryptocurrency that has seen fraudulent companies take advantage of clubs and fans, conflicts of interest where the Premier League are forced to regulate themselves, which means sanctions are light. And as you alluded to, the case in the Premier League's latest investigation of Manchester City, where the findings were timed to demonstrate the robustness of the Premier League's process. In fact, all that shows is how clubs are allegedly able to manipulate the market so freely across a number of seasons. Now, I realize that I've spent quite a long time painting quite a bleak picture in terms of the outlook for English football. I don't think that we are necessarily all doomed. This is not the end. English football can recover. But it is of vital importance now that we get the method of recovery right, that we toe the line between the need for some form of change and excessive interference into a unique market which has a cultural place in English society. An independent regulator on the surface is not a bad idea to help facilitate getting English football's house in order. If a regulator can, in the short term, solve some of the more pressing issues within English football, such as a new fit and proper persons test, supporter representation at boardroom level, fairer financial redistribution, an end to nefarious cryptocurrency companies intent on fleecing pockets of fans, then we will have got to a place where English football has failed to get to over the past number of seasons. But the idea that this should be an indefinite solution is a worrying one. In response to the findings of the fan-led review, the Football Association called to be given more power to be able to regulate themselves rather than hand it to an independent regulator. In theory, this should be the ideal scenario. We want the traditional governing body of English football to be able to effectively regulate the game, not Westminster. But in reality, given the power of the Premier League and the EFL, what we've seen is that struggle for power over the last 2 decades is the FA being muscled out of the driving seat consistently to the point where it has been the Premier League and the EFL with more power to make change. And that's something that's been alluded to by the Football Supporters Association and a lot of other stakeholders. What we therefore need, and my report for Civitas highlights this in detail, is a regulator whose primary job is to reinforce and restore the power of the FA. A regulator who's focused on modernising the FA's processes and give it a stronger voice when competing with, as you say, huge brands such as the Premier League, particularly at a time when super clubs are on the rise. Any regulator, therefore, should look to have a sunset clause, by which point this should be enabled. The issue we have now is that the future of English football has been tied to regulation. The fan-led review and the government's white paper seem intent on ensuring that the FA should never have power and to confine English football to an era of red tape. In terms of the actual aims of the regulator, some are very encouraging. The idea of a new and more robust fit and proper persons test is a sound one, protecting club heritage, such as banded name. And my report for Civitas makes 17 recommendations on this. Some of these, as I've just mentioned, agree with the regulator's aims. Some need refinement, and some, for example, the idea of a blanket transfer levy on Premier League clubs are simply bizarre from the regulator's point of view. But my main worry is away from the minutiae of the fan-led review of the white paper. It is on a wider level, and how the focus is too much on what a regulator could bring to club level and not on as much on what it can bring to a wider governance level. The measures laid out by the white paper should not have to be implemented by a regulator. Like everywhere else, it must be done by the governing body of the game, the Football Association, even if the regulation in the short term needs to help facilitate that, which is what its role should be. The fact that this isn't even on the table is something that concerns me and leaves English football on the precipice of uncertainty. We need to get this right, but in order to do that, we need to think more critically. And that's my 2 pence. Sorry, I know I've spoken for quite a long time.